The following article was sent to us by ChristianviewNetwork, and it states as follows. Former Archbishop Desmond Tutu is misleading people on what God says on euthanasia and assisted suicide. Former Archbishop Desmond Tutu muddles the issue on assisted suicide in a letter to the Washington Post on the 6th of October 2016, which was reported as front page headlines on the Sunday Times 9th October. The article by Christian View Network further states, if a financial advisor misleads his clients, he is found guilty of fraud and is punished. But if a religious leader misleads his followers, he is protected by religious freedom. Tutu's message on assisted suicide is religious equivalent of fraud, and it matters more than financial fraud because eternal issues are at stake. If you claim to represent God, you cannot make up your own views following the latest overseas political fad. Firstly, Tutu claims to support both the sanctity of life and assisted suicide. Secondly, Tutu says, I do not wish to be kept alive at all costs. Thirdly, he uses the misleading code word assisted dying, meaning assisted suicide or euthanasia. Fourthly, he asks, why are so many instead forced to endure terrible pain and suffering against their wishes? And fifthly, Tutu claims that suicide is dignity in dying. Not a single Bible verse was quoted. Well, Christian View Network further state that the debate on euthanasia is heating up this October in the lead-up to the 4th November 2016 hearing in the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein. We have a campaign plan to fight this, they says. Pulpit is investigating this burning issue and invited Philip Rosenthal from Christian View Network and also Professor Willem Landman to state their views on the opinions of this somewhat heated debate around euthanasia. Please note that due to the health concerns with the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he was not available for comment, and as such we have invited Professor Willem Landman from Dignity South Africa to shed some light on the issue of euthanasia. With that, gentlemen, good day to you and welcome.
It's good for you as our listener to know about Radio Pulpit's activities. Or do you need advice in an area of your life? Then why don't you log on to www.radiopulpit.co.za. Here you can talk to us, listen to us via live audio streaming, and there is also other reading material for the soul. What are you waiting for? Visit the Radio Pulpit website right now, www.radiopulpit.co.za. Radio Pulpit, your daily companion.
Well, I have the privilege of having a respondent online. Firstly, welcome Professor Willem Landman. Professor Landman, just in short, a bio of who you are and where you're from, sir?
I am involved with Dignity South Africa with this effort to get assisted dying legalized. I was an academic. I'm retired. I started the Ethics Institute, and I'm a professor extraordinaire in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Stellenbosch.
With that, thank you, sir, for your participation. Also from a Christian Network, Philip Rosenthal. Philip, just in short, where you're from, sir, and your background?
My name is Philip Rosenthal, and I'm the director of Christian View Network, which is a lobby group which lobbies for a number of different issues from a biblical Christian perspective, one of these being euthanasia and the sanctity of human life.
Gentlemen, with that, thank you so much for your participation. Professor Landman, can I start with you? What do you understand by sanctity of life? How do you see that, sir?
Well, it is a term that can be interpreted within the context of, for example, the Christian religion, or more widely. Given our constitutional democracy, I prefer to interpret it as human life having special moral value. So taking such life would be very serious, more seriously so than taking the life of animals, and having respect for that life is mandated by our social morality and by religion.
Philip, your understanding of sanctity of life?
I would agree with what Professor Landman has said, but I would add just from the scriptures that it adds a reason, which is that man is created in the image of God, which is similar to a coin being stamped with an image, which makes it more valuable than another piece of metal. And so that means that we don't have a right to destroy that at will.
Professor Landman, being from Dignity SA, what exactly is euthanasia or assisted dying, sir?
If I hear you correctly, is that what we mean by that?
Yes, sir. What do we mean by that?
Yes, the umbrella term is, that we use and that's in common usage is that of assisted dying. In other words, somebody's death is assisted by somebody else, for example, providing the means. But, it is an umbrella term that encompasses two kinds of practices that we have come to know. One is assisted suicide, where the final act in the process that leads to death is that of the person who dies. For example, taking certain medication that is provided by somebody else who assists. The second component would be voluntary euthanasia, where the final act is that of somebody else, not the person who dies, but somebody else who assists. For example, and I can give a concrete example, would be a lethal injection.
What does the Bible say with regards to this? Philip, your understanding, this assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia, does the Bible address these issues to your understanding?
I'd say that the Bible, yes, it does address the issue in three respects. So one, as we've referred to already, in terms of man being created in the image of God. The second is the general prohibition on murder, although there are certain exceptions which it explains are not murder, for example, self-defense from imminent danger, capital punishment, accidental killing or war. But then it also does give two case examples of actual euthanasia. The one is the suicide and euthanasia of Saul, and the other one is the euthanasia of Abimelech. Now, both of those are military euthanasias, where the person was already almost dead, but then somebody else completed the killing who was a friendly person rather than an opponent who was trying to put them out of pain. And those two examples are interesting because Saul, although it was a very, very hard case, he was in extreme pain and there was no hope of his recovery, the person who tried to give him a mercy killing was then tried and found guilty of murder afterwards. The other case was Abimelech, and that is an interesting case because he viewed being killed by a woman as beneath his dignity, and the Bible doesn't comment on it further in detail, but I think it's an illustration on how many different people have different ideas of subjectively what is dignity.
Professor Landman, is it possible to stand for the sanctity of life and euthanasia or assisted dying, assisted suicide in your understanding, sir?
I cannot, I'm not a theologian. I have a theology degree, so I cannot say, what the Bible says, except that I think in any interpretation of the Bible should take into consideration that it's not a manual from which we can simply read off solutions to practical and legislative issues that we have in modern society. I think what we need to do is to look at the interpretation of Christian values and principles. And there I'm guided by, by theologians who see that Christian values are consistent with this aid that we have for people who suffer terminally and who see this as the only way out. And I, as a believer, find it completely consistent that a loving and caring and compassionate God would allow us to intervene in these matters. I can, of course, support this in all sorts of other ways because we have practices that are perfectly accepted and acceptable in medical practice where we withdraw or withhold support, life-sustaining support. And, there is no real difference between those practices which we accept in our common practice and assisted dying because we have people having to reason, having to make decisions, having intentions, following that with certain actions and with certain outcomes. For example, if we withdraw life support or refuse to institute it in the first place, we have to make these decisions and we determine the time and manner of death in the tragic context of the end of life and terminal suffering. So my point of view is that, and I think it's completely consistent with Christian values and precepts, is that assisted dying is no different from these practices that we find completely commonplace.
Philip, your comments?
Okay, firstly, I would just respond to I don't like the term assisted dying because I believe it hides the issue of killing, and many other similar things have similar euphemisms. But then the question of the ethical difference here in terms of, although I mentioned two discrete ethical differences. The one is the issue of ordinary care versus extraordinary care, where ordinary care is the type of care that a person can get at home, whereas extraordinary care is kind of heart-lung machines, ventilators, intensive care units, and such like. And we don't have any problem with the withholding of, and also existing law doesn't have any problem with the withholding of extraordinary care. What we do have a problem with is the withholding of ordinary care and also the act of killing. Now, I think that this is something where there is a very serious ethical difference, and this can be borne out both in the military and also in the example of, for example, abortion as well, that sometimes the doctor might be trying to save the life of both the mother and the baby, but his actions would lead to the death of one. But his intention is to try and save both lives. His intention is not to actively kill, but he might need to take some action which leads to, for example, premature birth of a baby. Also in the military, there's a big ethical difference. For example, when a general such as Eisenhower orders some soldiers into battle where they are likely to die in battle versus the ethical difference where, for example, King David in the Bible ordered Uriah the Hittite into battle because he wanted him to die in battle so that he could steal his wife. Now, that's a massive ethical difference, but they might be doing the same thing outwardly, and the clear difference there is intention, and I think the law recognizes that difference in intention.
Very interesting you mentioned the law here. Professor Landman, what does the law say with regards to euthanasia in South Africa at the moment, according to your understanding, sir?
Well, our common law prohibits it because euthanasia, or then assisted dying in both its forms, including assisted suicide, is are regarded as forms of murder or crimes in our law. But the interesting thing is that our law changed last year with the Franklin Ford case when Judge Fabricius made his ruling, and that is he said that the particular applicant can ask for assistance with dying legally. He has legal authority to do that. Now, at the moment, we still have to. Anybody who seeks that assistance will have to approach a court, and that is a very cumbersome process. So, although the laws change, it has very little effect, and hence we have the appeal court hearing on the 4th of November, where the ministers and the National Prosecuting Authority are taking that ruling on appeal. But it's also interesting to look at our history, where the case going right back to the 70s, more than 40 years ago, when Dr. Hartmann was found guilty of assisting his father to die, and he had to be found guilty in terms of our common law. But the court only sentenced him until the arriving of the court. So he was literally just in jail for 2 minutes while standing in the court while the judge left the courtroom. And the point about that is that, the law acknowledges that the motive or the intention involved in assisted dying is quite different from the dolus or the evil intent of murdering somebody. So we're back to the point that was raised right at the beginning, that the prohibition to taking life is not an absolute one, and we have to look at legitimate exceptions, and we believe this is a legitimate exception. The point is, at the moment, that the common law clashes with our Constitution. The Constitution supersedes the common law. So we need an interpretation of the Constitution in respect of the right to die, and that is what's going to happen on the 4th of November.
Philip, you apparently have a campaign that plans to fight this. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Our organization is not the ones that are appealing the matter directly in court, but we are involved in advocating as Dignity SA is advocating in favor of euthanasia and assisted suicide. I would contest some of the comments that Professor Landman just said there in terms of the law. I would argue that this case that occurred last year was a scandalous abuse of the law, and that the law remains in force until such time as it is heard in the Constitutional Court, where it will inevitably be appealed by one side or another. The decision was based on that of the Canadian court and a very hasty trial that took place in the matter of a day in which I believe there were a number of irregularities in terms of the way that the whole thing was put forward, and I hope that those issues will be corrected in the appeal that will happen next. But I don't think that I wouldn't agree that the common law has changed now just because a certain judge has, in my opinion, abused his authority.
I didn't say the common law has been changed. Our law has changed. And this is what the judge said and what the senior advocates acknowledged, and that is that the law has changed, but it has to be changed properly in order to address the common law. The main point here is that we started off talking about Christian values and looking at this from the Christian point of view. In South Africa, we have atheists, we have Muslims, we have Christians, we have Jews, and that's where the Constitution has to come in. If we cannot reach agreement, which we will not, then the Constitution has to say to us what our rights are. And all we're asking for is a proper constitutional interpretation. We have many other practices that are legal that the majority of South Africans don't agree with. The majority of South Africans want capital punishment, are against abortion, are against same-sex marriages in terms of the knowledge that we have. But they are consistent with our legal framework. And the same applies to this category of we believe people who have rights. A very small number of people who have rights in terms of our constitutions, and those rights need to be recognized. And I believe personally that they are completely consistent with my Christian values.
Gentlemen, according to your knowledge, how are other nations dealing with this issue of euthanasia? Philip, can I start with you?
Okay, well, I would firstly contest those comments just taken, but I will reply first to your new question, which is that the countries that have, for the longest period, had legal euthanasia are the Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and there's many reports of very severe abuses and problems coming out of these countries, and each year they seem to extend the criteria further to more and more people being eligible for euthanasia. Canada has just recently legalized euthanasia, and then assisted suicide, but not euthanasia is legalized in American states such as Washington state. But there's a number of countries which have considered the matter and decided not to go this route. For example, last year the New Zealand High Court ruled that this was a decision for Parliament and not the courts, which I would agree. I believe that this is an abuse of the courts to attempt to try and take this issue that route, because I think these people know that if it goes to Parliament, it doesn't have a chance of getting passed. And I would also say that I would contest Professor Landman's interpretation of the Constitution. I don't believe that there is any indication in the Constitution itself that there was any will on the part of the Constitutional Assembly, even vaguely implied, to legalize euthanasia. But I think that they are hoping that they will find judges who, like Judge Fabricius, will read into the Constitution their own viewpoints and thus abuse their powers. I hope that this will not happen.
Prof. Landman, your response?
Well, I just want to correct this. It's not my interpretation of the Constitution. Once again, I'm not a constitutional expert, but anybody can read the Constitution and try and interpret it because it's in very simple language. The Bill of Rights of the Constitution is an ethical document which sets the framework for building a good society and for setting out the rights that we have against the state and against fellow citizens. But it's not my interpretation, it's that of all the top constitution lawyers. You can read Peter Carstens at the University of Pretoria, read one of the textbook writers in this regard. He agrees that there is such a right that can be inferred from other rights in the Constitution, such as the right to dignity and to autonomy. And it's also the interpretation of the judge. Now, I want to stress that this is not a matter that should be taken lightly. If this is legalized, and I do agree that this from the Supreme Court of Appeal, this would go to the Constitutional Court, and the idea is that this should go to Parliament. But there are very, very strict limitations to any such practice. And we have learned from other jurisdictions. We have learned from what has happened in Oregon, how it can be controlled and how it can be handled in a very dignified and controlled way. And in fact, the Constitutional Court in Canada on the 6th of February last year said, because of the 20 years experience of Oregon, we know how to do this properly. And they've called upon the Canadian Parliament to pass legislation. And we want to walk that same route because we believe there are people who die in a way that is really an assault on their dignity.
Yeah. Prof. Landman, Philip has spoken about news of abuses from Europe and countries who do apply euthanasia. Are you aware of any of these abuses? You talk about strict limitations, but are you aware of any of these abuses when it comes to assisted suicide and euthanasia?
In every practice in human life, there are abuses. We drive cars on the road, and some people drive under the influence. We are pathetic at handling that. We let people die on the roads because of drunken driving, and people with a state that refuses to implement the laws in this regard. Now, any practice, if it's admits of abuses, and I also want to say, the point is we don't ban driving, cars on the roads. We try and control it. Now, the same, often it is said that assisted dying would lead to abuses. The implication is, which I think is completely irrational, is that the current state of affairs, the status quo, has no abuses. Of course it has abuses. When it comes to withdrawing or withholding life-sustaining treatment, there are abuses, there are bad decisions taken. I don't think there are many, but in principle they do happen. The point I want to make when it comes to abuses is not that we're comparing a practice that might have all these abuses, and there are contrary evidence to that, versus the status quo which is free of abuses. There is unnecessary suffering which shouldn't happen, and that I consider to be an abuse.
Philip, in closing, is there such a thing as suicide dignity in dying? Your final thoughts, sir?
Firstly, no, we would say that all suicide is undignified and is inherently the opposite of dignity, but some people would have a different view to that they, like Abimelech, would say it's undignified to, for example, be killed by a woman or whatever. But I would also contest just this argument that there isn't a problem of abuses in two respects. Firstly, we can already see a creep, both in the local dignity SA's criteria on what they're prepared to argue euthanasia for just in a 2-year period. They've extended that from terminal illness to also unbearable suffering and now also to mental pain and suffering. We've also just in a short period seen the Canadians and the Belgians moving their criteria just in the space of the last 2 years. So such as a healthy 20-year-old can be euthanized. That's one form of abuse, but then there's also many other situations where, for example, elderly people are put under pressure to commit euthanasia because they're considered a financial burden, or where doctors give prescriptions where the person is supposed to have 6 months to live, but in Oregon, but in actual fact, they eventually kill themselves with years-old prescriptions where they live far beyond that period. So it doesn't seem to me that there are such controls underway.
If I can quickly respond to that, I think we should admit that this argument from abuse is a factual argument. It's an argument that is based on the fact. It's not a principled argument. And then we must look at the facts. And it's a complex issue. I just believe that there are jurisdictions where it's properly controlled and we can learn from that.
Professor Landman, your final thoughts on the issue of euthanasia?
I think that we have differences, which in a healthy society, we have differences of opinion. We have personal differences, we have religious differences, and we should respect one another's opinions in this regard. But when it comes to opinions and beliefs, deeply seated beliefs, I think we should respect that. But there are issues that put into question public policy. We need public policy, we need clarity, we need laws, in other words. We need perhaps a transformation or a development of our common law. There, the question is not an opinion poll amongst people about their personal beliefs and their religious beliefs. There, all we can go by is the interpretation of the Constitution, and the authorities to interpret the Constitution are the higher courts, and that they will do. So we have a life as individuals and as persons, as religious beings, but we also have a life as citizens, where we have to accept that other citizens have choices. They make choices which do not interfere with mine. They don't hurt me. If somebody asks to be assisted with dying in those dire days of terminal suffering, if they ask for that in the privacy of a hospital with their family around them, who am I? How can I be that cruel to deny that to them? And if it's their constitutional right, that is what should be the arbiter and not our interpersonal interpretation of the Bible. But as I've said, I believe that in my interpretation of the Bible, of a God who is caring and loving, I cannot believe that he would prohibit this. And this, you have foremost theologians in the world who agree with this.
Philip Rosenthal, your final thoughts, sir.
Okay, well, firstly, I'd contest that view that this is just a personal, private thing that doesn't affect anybody else. I think in the example now of Belgium, there's so many people that have been euthanized that just about everybody knows somebody else who has been in some way affected by this. People are put at risk, people are put at pressure, and many people are deeply unhappy about their family, members of their family or friends committing euthanasia or in the same old age home. And so I don't think that this can be at all considered a private matter, and we have a legislature which is elected to deal with these things. I don't believe that an elite group of judges can overrule the democratic decision of the majority on this, but it's possible that somebody may try to do this, as did Judge Fabricius in what I believe was an abuse of power, and then the rest of the country needs to resist this.
With that, gentlemen, it's clear that this time is not enough for the discussion of this issue, and keeping in mind the 4th of November 2016 also coming up, as the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein will make a decision on this as well. With that, sincere thanks to our respondents, Professor Willem Landman, and also to Philip Rosenthal from the Western Cape. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation in this program.
Thank you very much. Go well, Philip.
Thanks, sir.
With that, we have come to yet the end of another Brandpunt, our burning issue program on a Friday morning. Don't forget that the opinions stated in this program is not necessarily that of Radio Pulpit or the announcer on duty, but for you, our listener, to make an informed decision. Till we meet again, keep well, God bless you, and shalom.
One vision, one voice.